Decisions made in Washington can affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Washington Wise is an original podcast from Charles Schwab that unpacks the stories making news in Washington right now and how they may affect your finances and portfolio. Listen at schwab.com/WashingtonWise. Decisions made in Washington can affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Washington Wise is an original podcast from Charles Schwab that unpacks the stories making news in Washington right now and how they may affect your finances and portfolio. Listen at schwab.com/WashingtonWise.
Jesse Michael Allison. Elizabeth Jane Anderson.
A few weeks ago, a small group of protesters gathered in front of North Carolina's Supreme Court. They were there to read a list of names. They started at 6 a.m. They estimated they would be reading for 17 hours.
I do want to stress they have been out here all day long, braving the cold. They're going to be out here until midnight, they told me, reading these 60,000 names because they tell me the names and the votes deserve to be heard and to be counted.
These people were reading the names of voters, people who voted for a Democrat named Allison Riggs to serve on the state Supreme Court back in November. Her opponent, a guy named Jefferson Griffin, is trying to throw these votes out.
Her opponent argues that their votes were illegitimate and unlawful and that months after the election, they need to be tossed out, just enough so that he can be declared the true victor and her triumph can be erased.
60,000 people is a lot of people.
It's a huge number of people. It's also not even the total universe of people who he wants to disqualify in theory.
Slate's Mark Joseph Stern has been following this election since before votes were even cast. At one point in this protest, Allison Riggs, the Supreme Court justice who's having her election challenged, her parents get up and they read their own names because their votes for their daughter are being challenged. Why? How? It just seems like...
I can one-up you on that, Mary. Another person whose vote is being challenged by Judge Jefferson Griffin, one of the victims of the D.C. plane collision, one of the service members in the helicopter, that vote is now being challenged in court. What's going on here? It takes a lot of time and mind-bending legal illogic to get through all of it. But I think the simplest way to put it is that Jefferson Griffin lost this election by 734 votes. Multiple recounts confirmed that he lost. And so in order to reverse that loss, he is just going through the voter files and trying to nullify as many ballots as it takes to overturn his defeat and transform it into a victory.
Here's the thing. Mark and I know that you may be thinking as you hear us talking, what does this one election for state Supreme Court judge mean to me? So I asked Mark to lay out the stakes for you, my listeners.
If they cared about Stop the Steal in 2020, they should care about Stop the Steal in 2025, even though it's just one state Supreme Court seat. It is a test run of a new playbook.
Today on the show, Republicans in North Carolina are creating a whole new way to tinker with elections. We'll explain how. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies. This process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit Progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states. Can you just introduce me to who my main characters are here? Like this Supreme Court race, it's between Allison Riggs, who's a Democrat, right? And she's already a sitting Supreme Court justice.
Yes.
And she had this guy, Jefferson Griffin, a Republican, running against her. Who are these folks?
So Jefferson Griffin is a judge on the North Carolina Court of Appeals, so the intermediate court below the state Supreme Court. And he is running for, I should use the past tense, really. He ran for this seat that's currently held by Justice Allison Riggs. She is a Democrat. She is a former civil rights attorney, voting rights attorney. They had a very close race, and she ultimately prevailed by 734 votes, which is a close margin, certainly not the narrowest margin in North Carolina history, let alone national history. But the North Carolina Supreme Court is divided 5-2 between Republicans and Democrats.
That's so interesting to me because that means the Republicans are fighting really hard for this one seat when they already clearly have the majority on the court.
Yes, but, and this is something that Justice Allison Riggs actually told us. Dahlia Lithwick and I interviewed her for Amicus some months back before the election, and she pointed out, there's this race, 2024. There's another one in 2026 for the other Democrat. And then in 2028, there's going to be 3 Republican justices up for election. So if you're playing the long game, they are thinking, how do we build as much of a defense as possible against the seemingly leftward trend of our state? And that plan requires, I think, DQing Allison Riggs after she won her election.
Okay, so this all starts on election night. It looks like Allison Riggs, the Democrat, may be losing her seat. Then she starts to pull ahead just like by a squeaker, these like 700 plus votes. What does Jefferson Griffin, her opponent, do then? Does he immediately go on the offense?
So it's interesting. He goes on the offense legally and publicly goes silent. But he hires a bunch of Republican lawyers who fan out across the state and start filing objections to various ballots and counts of ballots, arguing that they should not be allowed, that they should be thrown out. That doesn't work. He can't get enough ballots thrown out. So then he asks for a recount, and the recount confirms that Allison Riggs won. And so normally, under state law and precedent, and I would dare say American tradition, that's when you throw in the towel.
Yeah, it's game, set, match.
Yeah, that's usually it. But he said, no. Well, I should say his lawyers, speaking on his behalf, said, we're going to try something different. We are going to try to disqualify 60,000 plus ballots that have already been counted in every other race. Remember, there are a lot of different races on an individual ballot. So these votes have already been counted for a bunch of different races. But for this particular race, we think that they should be thrown out. And he's only challenging these voters in large, populous, heavily Democratic, heavily Black counties. He is not challenging voters from conservative, white, rural counties. So Jefferson Griffin has targeted with almost surgical precision a universe of voters who are very likely to be Allison Riggs voters, and then arbitrarily drawn lines around them, geographic lines, legal lines, and argued that their votes should be tossed.
But why? What's the reasoning here?
Yeah, there's 3 groups of voters he's targeting. The top line info that I want to make very clear, and I want everyone to remember, is that at the time of the election, under state law and authoritative interpretations of state law, all of these people were allowed to vote. So these are not controversial until Jefferson Griffin comes in and starts trying to nitpick them. The first group is military and overseas voters who did not send a copy of their photo ID when they mailed in their ballot or transmitted their ballot from overseas. State law does not require them to do so. And yet Jefferson Griffin is arguing that their ballots should be thrown out.
Okay, but like that's not the rule. So like they didn't do it.
But rules are for suckers, Mary. Rules are for suckers. I think it's pretty clear.
I hate it here, Mark.
Okay, the second category is this is a really small category, and I almost feel like you threw it in just to kind of confuse people. It is this incredibly small group of children of North Carolina residents who live overseas, who have never formally established North Carolina as their domicile, but whose closest connection to any state is North Carolina. So imagine someone who's in the armed forces, who's lived in military bases all around the world, right, for his entire adult life, who has a kid. And this guy is from North Carolina. He has raised his kid to be a North Carolinian. His kid has been traveling with him all around the world, different bases. So that kid has never actually lived for a long time in the United States. Where should they vote? North Carolina, under state law, says you should vote here. The North Carolina legislature enacted a statute with no dissent years ago saying that in this weird and narrow situation, those children should vote in our state if that's where their parents are from. And yet now Jefferson Griffin is arguing that that law is unconstitutional and those ballots should be thrown out.
Okay. What's the third category? This is the biggest one, right?
This is the big kahuna. This is 60,000 plus people. So these are people whose voter registration files in North Carolina allegedly do not include either the last 4 digits of their social security number or the last 4 digits of their driver's license number. A few problems with this. First of all, a quick analysis by the State Board of Elections shows that at least half of these 60,000 people actually do have those numbers on file. That Griffin's lawyers are just lying about this, or they're just wrong about this. Nobody really knows, but at least half of those people are actually have all of their information on file.
Is there a valid reason why someone wouldn't have this information in their file?
Okay, so that's the next problem, is that it turns out that there are fairly frequently clerical errors where the clerks and other employees of the boards of elections do not enter this information for whatever reason. And we know that happens because a bunch of the people who've been targeted have come forward and they have their own copy of the voter registration form they submitted. And they say, look, I put the last 4 digits of my social in here. I don't know why it's not in the computer, but I put it on my form. And so through no fault of their own, that information didn't make it into the system. The last problem, and maybe this is the biggest one of all, is that that information is not required to be in the system in order for them to vote. The argument that Jefferson Griffin is making here, that they have to have that information on their file in order for them to be able to cast a ballot, is just wrong. You have to bend and twist and contort the law beyond all reason in order to make that argument. And it's one that I think every court should at least just laugh out of the room.
But courts haven't laughed it out of the room. Griffin brought his case straight to the North Carolina Supreme Court, the very court he is trying to get a seat on.
And he says to them, hey, before any other court really takes a look at this, before this is litigated in the lower courts, I want you to block the certification of this election. And then I want you to decide this election in my favor. And they do. They block the certification of the election and they get ready to decide it in his favor. But then, this is really interesting, 2 of the conservative justices start making noises. They say, we're not so sure about this. This is looking bad. And so the others say, okay, fine, we'll kick it back to the lower courts. And so that is where it is right now, toiling away in the lower courts as we speak.
So it's a sort of half-seat decision where the certification is on ice, but the Supreme Court isn't deciding the outcome.
Yes, but it's weird because the Supreme Court has already pretty much shown its cards. You have 2 conservative justices and 1 liberal justice pretty much saying, we don't think that Griffin should be allowed to steal this election. And then you have 3 other conservative justices saying, we definitely want to steal this election for Jefferson Griffin.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Have you ever spotted McDonald's hot, crispy fries right as they're being scooped into the carton? And time just stands still. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. During tax season, your personal info travels to a lot of places. Between payroll, your tax consultant, and the IRS. If your W-2 gets exposed, that's just the ticket for identity thieves. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it guaranteed or your money back. Don't let identity thieves take you for a ride. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Oh, it's such a clutch off-season pickup, Dave.
I was worried we'd bring back the same team.
I meant those blackout motorized shades.
Blinds.com made it crazy affordable to replace our old blinds.
Hard to install?
No, it's easy. I installed these and then got some for my mom. She talked to a design consultant for free and scheduled a professional measure and install.
Hall of Fame son.
They're the #1 online retailer of custom window coverings in the world.
Blinds.com is the GOAT.
Shop Blinds.com right now and get up to 45% off select styles. Rules and restrictions may apply.
I want to make sure that we focus on something that I think is important here, which is that this whole theory that you can challenge votes after the fact in this particular way, it was conceived of by a conservative organization, right? The Election Integrity Network. Is it worth talking about where this whole idea of how to challenge elections came from?
Well, I mean, you're talking about the Stop the Steal playbook, right? And the idea at the time was that there are an untold number of fraudulent voters or dead voters who need to be smoked out and have their ballots nullified. And once those ballots are nullified, then the Republican will be the true victor. I mean, that was the theory of 2020, and that's the theory of today. And it's no surprise to me that some of the same legal players from 2020 are coming out of the woodwork to help Jefferson Griffin now, because as I said, this is not just about one state Supreme Court seat. This is about so much more. It's about vindicating this very dangerous theory that you can just alter enough votes after the election to change the outcome. I mean, that just feels fundamentally wrong to many, many people, including some Republicans, by the way, who have spoken out against this. But if you can make it work in North Carolina, you can make it work in other places, including potentially on the national stage in upcoming federal elections.
So update me on where Jefferson Griffin's case is now. The state Supreme Court put the certification of the election on hold, bounced it back to lower courts. So this is winding its way through state courts right now?
Yes. So Justice Riggs tried to remove the case to federal court. The federal court said, we need to see how this plays out in state court first.
But isn't state court filled with people who know both Jefferson Griffin and Allison Riggs?
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, oh my God, the conflicts of interest here are just crazy, right? Like, not only are the state Supreme Court justices deciding who's going to sit with them, but at least two of those justices have spouses who have given money to Jefferson Griffin's campaign. Also, one of the Republican judges on the North Carolina Court of Appeals is helping to fund Griffin's legal battle at this moment, and it is not clear that he will recuse if he gets assigned to this case. So, like, there are very good practical reasons to remove this case to federal court, and there are somewhat good legal reasons, but it ended up before some conservative judges, and the conservative judges basically just shrugged and said, we want to see how this plays out. So Riggs was out of luck. She went back to state court. The Superior Court ruled in her favor. It ruled against Judge Griffin, and it ruled for the Board of Elections. It said Griffin's protests are meritless. They must be rejected. So this is a good decision from the Superior Court. The problem now is that it's going to be appealed to the North Carolina Court of Appeals, which has a 12-3 Republican majority, including one of those Republican judges who is funding Griffin's challenge here, who may not step aside because ethics rules are for suckers. And then it'll go up to the North Carolina Supreme Court, which, as we know, has at least 3 justices who want to steal this election.
I feel like I'm like in the snake eating its own tail moment. Like
it's crazy.
It's crazy.
You do these head counts and you're like, how can this be? Like, did Satan himself devise this scenario to torture like legal journalists who follow North Carolina? Like specifically me?
But this is going to have to end up in front of the federal court at some point, right? Because it'll go to the North Carolina Supreme Court. It'll have to be appealed from there, right?
So here's the problem. The problem is that appeals from the North Carolina Supreme Court have to go straight to the U.S. Supreme Court. And I don't think the U.S. Supreme Court is going to want to get involved in this. I also think that there's a real chance that the North Carolina Supreme Court could deadlock, could like split 3-3, and that could sort of leave everybody in limbo. I mean, it's not a good outcome for any kind of definitive decision. But also beyond that, it is a parable about the politicization of a judiciary. You know, the North Carolina judiciary, until recently, leaned somewhat left. The North Carolina Supreme Court had a left lean. Republicans then introduced partisan judicial elections and poured money into Republican campaigns to take over North Carolina's higher courts and turn them into just a bastion of sort of MAGA. And, it's really disturbing to see these robed partisans acting in such flagrantly political and, in my view, corrupt ways because, the judiciary obviously is not supposed to be political. It's supposed to be independent and neutral and the arbiter of disputes that might have a political valence, but ultimately have a correct legal answer. And what we see when courts get too politicized, especially when they're shifted to the right like this, is that Republicans will just decide there's only one right legal answer and it's the one that helps our party. That's what's going on right now in North Carolina. And that's why we so desperately need to see federal judicial intervention at some point.
Okay, it's clear how you feel about this case. Is there any generous interpretation of what Jefferson Griffin, this Republican judge, is up to here? Like, how would he explain what he's doing?
Well, so that's the funny thing, Mary. I think if there were a generous interpretation of this, then Jefferson Griffin would be out in front of the cameras providing it to us. But he isn't, because he's gone radio silent. He's retreated to his lair, and he is letting his lawyers do all of the dirty work. And I think that silence really does speak volumes. I don't think it can be defended. I really don't. I don't think the legal arguments can be defended. I don't think the tactics can be defended. I think it's all incredibly disturbing and does not look like a functioning democracy in any way, shape, or form.
You know who's not being silent? The voters whose votes could be overturned here or at risk of being overturned. It's so interesting. Like, there are all these internet videos of people being like, hello, my name is blank and I voted, but, I moved around a lot. And so now they're saying my vote doesn't count, but hi, here I am.
And I'm now finding out that Judge Jefferson Griffin is trying to throw out 60,000 early voters and 5,500 military and overseas voters, which included my name and my wife's, which makes me furious. We complied with all of the laws and did everything we needed to. I voted in Forsyth County.
And the judge, too, Allison Riggs, she's not being quiet either. She's saying this could be the death of democracy.
If the people in power don't like who wins the election and can decide to just disregard the will of voters, democracy dies. If people in power can...
So Justice Allison Riggs, she has spent many years in the trenches fighting for voting rights. And so in some ways, it's a little ironic that now she herself is like in the hot seat and her voters, the people who tried to keep her in office, are facing the kind of disenfranchisement that as a civil rights attorney, she battled for years. And here, she is battling for her own survival on the court that voters returned her to. And so I hope that she and her voters and the Board of Elections and everybody who's on the right side of this can continue to draw public attention because it can't all be happening in darkness or in quiet or in secrecy. It looks a lot like Stop the Steal, but with a better chance of success. And we all know that these kind of malign schemes tend to do better when everybody is paying attention to some shiny, bright object elsewhere.
Mark, I'm really grateful for your time and your reporting. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much, Mary.
Mark Joseph Stern is a senior writer covering the courts and the law for Slate. Go check out his interview with Justice Allison Riggs over at Amicus, wherever you get your podcasts. And that's our show. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, Madeline Ducharme, and Ethan Oberman. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. Go track me down over at Blue Sky if you'd like. I'm at Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. Catch you back here next time.